I'm refinishing this floor because of some water damage. I like to hang plastic over anything that would be hard to clean or move, and to section off areas of the house that I'm not working in. The equipment I use has good dust extraction, but the plastic is good insurance in case a vacuum hose comes loose during sanding. This homeowner had her washing machine leak while she was out of the house, which caused a small flood in her hallway and living room. Some of the water had soaked into the oak floor and caused the boards to warp. I'm pulling off the doors that have hardwood on both sides, so I don't have to swing the door back and forth over and over while I work. Removing baseboards isn't always necessary. Removing and reattaching them takes additional work, and they'll need putty or caulk and touch-up paint, depending on the style. The boards in this closet were loose for some reason. I'm pulling them tight and securing them with nails. This will be easier than trying to putty the large gaps. I use a vacuum with a cyclone separator that drops the dust into a plastic bag. It helps to keep the vacuum filters clean and the airflow at full power. It keeps the sanding dust from getting on everything, and it also makes the environment nicer to work in. This machine is big. That's why we call it the big machine. It uses 220 volt power and weighs more than I do. I have to disassemble it for transport, but even in two pieces, it's still heavy. It's very powerful and can remove the old finish and flatten things out pretty fast, but it also takes a lot of skill to operate. The homeowner originally called a flood remediation company, and the salesman told her they'd need to tear out the entire floor, inspect the subfloor, replace any damaged sections, run fans to dry everything out, then install a whole new hardwood floor. It was going to cost over $20,000 and take several weeks to complete. She told me she felt like the salesman was trying to scare her into doing all this work, so she called me for a second opinion. I'm not an expert on flooding, but I know that wood getting wet one time is unlikely to cause long-term structural damage. I checked that her crawl space had adequate ventilation, so any water that made it through the vapor barrier into the subfloor would be able to dry out. Then I took moisture readings on the oak flooring, which was reading around 18% in the worst areas, where the water had pooled, but most of the floor was still reading in a normal range and was unaffected. That told me that the flooding couldn't have been that bad or it would have spread further. Sanding the floor at an angle is more aggressive and removes material faster. It takes more work to get the sanding scratches out, but at this stage I'm focusing on getting the wood clean and flat. In large open rooms like this, where there's long sight lines with windows at the end, the low-angle light really highlights any imperfections in the floor. So after I used a belt sander to strip off the old finish and roughly even things out, I used a planetary sander to get things as flat as possible. This one has 4 gear-driven heads that each spin individually and as a group. It takes longer to sand the floor this way, but it flattens things out that a belt sander would tend to ride over and leave. With most floors, if you look at a low angle towards a window, you can see those dips and waves from the belt sander. I'm using a specialty tool called a pencil on a stick to draw all over the floor. This helps to make sure I've sanded out the scratches from the previous pass. I was pretty sure the floor could be saved, so I recommended running a dehumidifier for a couple of months. Then we could reassess the damage after everything was dried out. She still wanted to refinish it though, since it was showing signs of wear and the finish had turned orange over the years. Sanding the edges is the part people complain about most when they try it. Normally you have to use the edge sander everywhere that the big machine can't reach. In hallways or small spaces, that can be most of the floor. The planetary sander gets much closer to the wall, so luckily I have a lot less work to do on the edges. Wood floors move with the seasons. During the winter, the cold, dry air causes the boards to shrink. Then in the summer, when there's more humidity, they soak up the water and expand. This floor was reading around 10%, so I knew the gaps between boards weren't going to close up on their own. I'm using a trowel to spread putty over the entire floor, which will fill all of those in. This doesn't make sense for every floor, but here it was going to help things look brand new. I'm using a buffer with a multi-disc head. This helps to blend the edges and the middle of the floor, which were sanded with different machines. First, I run a pass with metal plates behind the sandpaper to make sure everything stays flat. Then I run a second pass with cushioned pads to help take out any remaining fine scratches. In the end, that's a total of 6 sanding passes over the middle of the floor before the finish goes on. Most refinishing is done with 2 or 3 passes on a belt sander, then 1 pass with a buffer. This process is slower, but it gives a much nicer result. So after running a dehumidifier for a couple months, I came back to begin work, and sure enough, everything was reading back at a normal moisture range, and there were no signs of mold or any other water damage. The warped boards had flattened back out, and I didn't find anything that needed to be replaced. The floor ended up just needing a basic refinish, which only cost her about $3,000. So in the end, she saved around $20,000 of unnecessary work, as well as the extra weeks of having her home turned into a construction site. The homeowner wanted to keep things looking as light as possible, so I'm using bone-in natural seal for the first coat, which has some white pigment in it that keeps the tone of the wood from darkening from the finish. After that, the floor gets 2 more coats with Bonatraffic HD. It's a low VOC water-based finish with excellent durability for long-term wear. It doesn't have any of the toxic fumes like Swedish or oil-based polyurethanes, so she'll be able to move right back in after I'm done. After the second coat dries, I use a fine grit abrasive on the orbital sander and buffer to smooth out any roughness in the finish. Then I vacuum the floor and use a tack mop to get everything as clean as I can before rolling on the final coat. I'll come back the next day to pull the tape and plastic, rehang the doors, and do a walkthrough to make sure everything looks good. That way I can catch any minor issues and fix them before the customer has to deal with it. It also gives me a nice opportunity to take some photos of my work. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. The room didn't have much in the way of overhead lights, so going with the lighter color also helped to brighten up the room and made the space feel a lot bigger. Let me know if you had any questions about the tools or materials I'm using, if you want to know more about the process, or if you're planning on starting your own hardwood flooring project soon. Leave a comment below and I'll try to answer any questions. Thanks for watching.